Well, great. It's a great article by Brennan Bernards of Forbes. It's called 2021 College Admission Predictions. And it's the type of article that just really lends itself to discussion and making it open-ended. So, Mark, you and I know that there are 4 points to this article. And what I'm going to do is give the heading to the point and throw out a quote or two, and then we'll discuss it. Sounds good?
But let me set the context. So,
okay.
About a year ago, we did another article on predictions for 2020. So I think what's happening is Brandon's going to do this now annually. And what he does is he surveys a whole bunch of deans, directors, VPs of enrollment, and he asks them, what do you see happening based on, you're in the trenches. What do you see as the big trends for 2021? And so he interviewed a bunch of people just to get their predictions on what he saw or what the leaders in the field see as the coming trends in 2021. And then he kind of summarized them into a bunch of categories. I just wanted to kind of create that context, Dave.
All righty. So there are 4 major prediction categories that Brennan talks about. And the first one is enrollment trends. And the first quote I actually have 2 quotes under enrollment trends. The first is by Jerry Lucido, who is a dean of strategic enrollment at USC. And he says, quote, all but the most highly selective colleges will hedge their bets and open the doors wider. And then I'll have a second quote by Charles Lloyd, the president of White Mountain Community College. And he says, quote, after seeing a year of unpredictability from all perspectives, the fall of 2021 may prove to be a brighter season for community college enrollment. So based on those 2 quotes, Mark, what insights do you have?
Yeah, and I'm also going to throw a couple other things that they said in there into this section. So as far as hedge their bets and open their doors wider, I'm really glad that we're emphasizing this because there's so much buzz in the media about how the most selective schools are getting so many more applicants. We know that the masses are the opposite. And it's particularly true for students of color, students that apply for financial aid. And this stuff is tracked. You can look at things like how many FAFSA applications are completed. FAFSA, the free application for federal student aid. You can see that these numbers are down. You can look at students applying who are requesting financial aid. And something like the Common App, which has incredible data because of the millions of people that use it. And you can see where the applications are down. And for students, this comes up a little bit later again when I'll address it again, because I know that one of the points he makes is about access. So we see that over and over and over again. And we know that colleges lost a lot of money. And we know that they experienced overall less applications from less students, too. Keep in mind, students are applying to more schools. So less students. So what do? You need more money. You got to cast a wider net. So most schools are going to be a little bit more generous when it comes to the point of acceptance. When it comes to the point about community colleges that you made, yeah, this is a big reality. But community colleges got killed. Like, really once again, it shouldn't be surprising because we did talk about how regional publics and community colleges are where you're seeing less applications. And so one of the things it says in this article that I think is noteworthy, when you say, well, why did that happen? So one of the things it says is many students chose not to attend school. And it says they end up assisting children with remote learning, having to work more hours, or make up for other loss of household income. And then one of the things he says in this article is that community colleges, actually, their biggest competitor, their biggest rival is no college. So here's what he said. He said he's quick to add, of course, brighter is relative after the national sector was down 10% year over year in 2020. Lloyd believes many students chose the popular alternative to going to community college this fall, which is our longtime rival, no college. So community college often competes with no college. Many people that go to community colleges forego, is that a word for went? They forego, I want to say foregone college to work. And we talked about this before. We say, hey, when you're food insecure, you're not thinking about college. And so he expects with the rebound of the economy and with, things going the right direction for things to have an uptick when it comes to community college. Anything else you want to say on that, Dave?
Yeah, and that would make perfect sense. And he did mention too that uh, we are many students took gap years. In some schools, it was high as 10, 15%. So a lot of those gap year students are going to be coming back into the fray. And of course, for the more selective colleges, the kids took gap years, and for the community colleges you mentioned, it was often gap year meant you didn't go to college. And quite frankly, I think a large segment of the student population just weren't comfortable with paying money for this new concept of online education, and that they're looking forward to getting back to face to face. But that's the next category, so I won't get too much.
Yeah,
into
before
that.
you get back to that, I want to make another point that Lucido from USC made. And keep in mind, what happened was Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation gave a grant to USC, to the USC Center for Enrollment Research Policy and Practice, their CERPP. And it was to study the impact of COVID-19 on student enrollments. So Lucido's looking at a lot of the research there. And one of the things he says is testing is now optional at best, missing in many files. The ability to travel and experience campuses is highly limited. Activities are more difficult to access. Then he says that. Then he says, this means the strength of the curriculum completed and the grades achieved, which have always been the most important factors, and he says this is really important, will play an even stronger role.
Yes.
And I just want to underscore that, because when there's less focus on testing and you don't have as much activities and you can't really evaluate who visits the campus and doesn't visit the campus and have some of that engagement, or you're not traveling as much, that has to go somewhere, that other emphasis. And where it's going to go is to curriculum and grades and curriculum and grade trends. So we've talked about that before, but I just want to get that out there. And then that's what I had on this point, Dave.
Yes, and you know, I talked with my daughter about how she felt that it was so much more challenging for kids, because the reality is most students don't want their whole decision point to come down to just their grades, because you know most students are at the top of their class, and that extracurriculars, and believe it or not, testing as well, because some students, there is a portion of students whose testing is somewhat better than their grades, do like to have as many other factors to round out the picture. Well, the fact is, this year they're looking at a very narrow picture. So that has been highly disadvantageous to many students who require a much more broader approach. So it's been a tough year for these kids.
I mean, the only thing I would say on that is that most schools have gone test optional, not test blind. And test optional does allow you to have your testing included if you're a strong tester.
That's true. But as we pointed out before, many kids who wanted to get tested couldn't because their test sites weren't available. So it's been tough.
All right, let's go to the next one.
Good. Virtual reality. Mike Drish, the director of first-year admissions of University of Massachusetts at Amherst, said, quote, "There is a comfort now with the virtual engagement bracket webinars, social media, virtual tours for both admission officers and prospective families. And that will allow many colleges to have a broader reach than ever before and greater access for years to come. Everybody has the setup, so it seems likely that a return to in-person recruitment will be accented by virtual engagement."
So I could not agree more with this point. So this week I participated in 2 different webinars with groups of colleges. So one was with 6 schools. It was Swarthmore, Bowdoin, Carleton, Amherst, Williams, and Pomona. And then I was on another one with 5 southern schools, including Trinity in San Antonio, Sewanee in Tennessee, Furman in South Carolina, Rhodes in Memphis, and Rollins in Winter Park, Florida.
Winter Park,
Yeah,
Florida.
Winter
Great
Park.
destination.
Yeah, we did a spotlight on them. Yeah. So those are the 5. And interesting, one of the points that was brought up in the one session, Seth Allen, who's the dean of admission at Pomona, he said, I love doing counselor breakfasts, and I miss doing counselor breakfasts. But he said, you want to know how many people are on this call right now? 753 counselors. Said, I've never done a counselor breakfast with 753 people before. He said, there's no way in the world we're giving this up. So virtual reality and engagement is here to stay. Colleges, quite frankly, have been blown away at the attendance, not to mention the low cost and ease on their part to do it. You know, you're not traveling and having your whole staff set the logistics up of all these breakfasts and these meetings that they'll do for counselors. Now, they're still going to want to go back to some of that. Don't say, you know, like there's a young yearning. We're social creatures, and there's a yearning for human connection, and it's especially admissions people. In general, it's a group of extroverts, you know, and even the introverts have learned to turn on the extroversion for that part of the job. But there's no doubt about it that virtual connections are here to stay, and they're only going to get better and better. That's the thing that I would add. With another year to study what, you know, best practices of what their peers and competitors are doing, and with more and more advances in technology, they're only going to get better and better and better. So that's definitely here to stay.
Yep. As one person said, we love virtual reality, but we're all looking forward to actually taking our pants out of the closet and wearing them from time to time.
No, it's true. And that's the quote from Grant Goslin, director of undergraduate at Boston College. Yeah. He says place-based education will be in high demand. And what does he say? He says, look, high school and college students are exhausted by online learning. They long for personal connections that online learning simply cannot provide. A lot of ways, the residential colleges, they feel like they got a chance for people to see their value because you got to not experience it for a while and you just realize how important it is. So a resurgence and return to residential education is one of the things that he's predicting is one of the big trends for 2021.
That's right. Okay, next point. Testing. Boy, we've talked a lot about testing, and I'm going to say another quote from Mike Drish, the director of admissions of UMass Amherst. And not surprisingly, this is what he says, quote, SAT optional for a few admission cycles means a potential new normal, and risk-adverse institutions may be concerned about returning to requiring test scores and therefore losing any perceived gain in these years. And we've talked about this a lot, Mark.
Yeah, but let me just share some more things that have happened even this week. So first of all, you know, like a guide I recommend every family purchase. It was one of the recommended resources I was most passionate about is the FISC Guide to the Colleges. They announced this week that they are no longer going to be including ACT and SAT information in their guide. Let me tell you why this is powerful. Because one of the reasons why schools have been so concerned about their test scores hasn't necessarily been because they felt like they were predicting academic success at their institution. They're just concerned that that's one of the measuring tools that the public uses on how good they are. And if all the guides are going to have them listed, and if the public thinks the better the testing, the better the school, then they have to be conscious of that, or they do, you know, they ignore that at their own peril. So what FISC does, others are going to copy. And so that becomes a trend. That's another thing to undermine testing. Now, I told you I did 2 webinars this week, 6 schools in one, 5 in the other. All 11 of those colleges were test optional last year. And every one of them has already announced that they're test optional this year. And in that first group, you know, Bowdoin, Williams, Amherst, Swarthmore, Pomona, and Carleton, only school that had been test optional in there before was Bowdoin. So it was new for everybody else in that group. Every one of them, this was a huge part of the conversation on the webinar. Testing, role of testing, and they all indicated that they've been surprised how well they can read a file. They all indicated once you've done something a couple years, it becomes habit, you begin comfortable with it, and chances are quite high that you'll be doing it in the foreseeable future. But you know, I do want to take people behind the scenes on something that I don't think we've talked about on this podcast. So let me ask you a question, Dave. Who do you think deans of admission report to? And it's not a one-size-fits-all answer. There are different answers, but what do you think they report to?
I would say right to the top. So the chancellor, the president, or the chairman of the board of governors, but they report to the big kahuna in that institution that makes all the hiring and firing decisions.
So in some institutions, especially VP of enrollments, will report directly to the president. But it's also very common to see a model where the dean of admission reports to the provost. You know what the provost is, Dave?
I always wondered what that meant. Was it like the vice president?
It's basically your chief academic officer.
Okay.
In other words, a lot of schools, your director of admission has to report to the head of the faculty.
Oh,
now, let me tell you something that's going on behind the scenes at almost every one of these institutions. The admission office is saying test optional is great. We love it. We can read files. We can make great decisions without scores. Now, the admission office is incentivized to do that because the audience for the admission office is the person not in the college yet, right?
right.
You're focused on prospects. And so you know how prospects think. You know they don't like testing being required. You also know your competitors are going test optional. And that's going to put even more pressure on you if they do it and you don't. You also believe you have the skills within your office to read the file. And a lot of them legitimately have concerns like, well, we've talked about over and over again, how tests are highly correlated to parent income, parent education, and have a built-in bias and the ability of families to supplement them with, expensive test prep. So they've always been troubled by that. But the big concern they're going to have is that our applicants like that we're test optional and our competitors are doing it. So you're just going to make my job that much harder. Now, on the other side, faculty like test scores.
Right.
They just believe that there's something about test scores that is highly correlated to quality. And if you're getting away from test scores, to a lot of faculty, that means you're lowering your academic standards. So at a lot of institutions over the next few years, behind the scenes, unbeknownst to anything you will ever see, I will ever see, is this war that goes on. And I mean, I have experienced this before when I was in the game. And I know that this is happening and it's going to happen. And so it's like a big arm wrestle. Faculty, we want test scores. Admission office, do you want students? Do you want really good students? And so we'll see how it plays out. My guess is that the test optional is going to end up winning the day because, remember, the admission office is also highly correlated to the budget, and the budget runs your school. And I think the fact that so many other schools are doing it will be enough weight for most of the admission offices to win the day. Like right now, they have a built-in excuse, which is students are unable to take it, so we can't do it. But when that blows over, then you're going to see what becomes ongoing policy. But I do have one other announcement to make, and then, Dave, I'll let you talk. So I don't know if I'm introducing a whole can of worms here, but another trend that I'm watching, and we've brought it up before, the test blind movement is really picking up some momentum. When Worcester Polytech Institute went test optional, I don't know if it was 5 years ago. Don't quote me on that. It feels around that long ago. It was a big deal because you hardly see, it's a very selective school with really high average scores, and you don't usually see, engineering, computer, STEM-based technical schools, which tend to put the most emphasis on scores, go test optional. So that was like a big landmine in the college admissions world when WPI said they were going test optional. Well, this week they said they're going test blind.
Wow.
And so I just see an incredible momentum right now for the test optional and the test blind movement. And I think what people don't understand is if you're taking away test scores, that means you're putting more weight on rigor and grades, right? Well, the student that can go into AP Physics or BC Calc and do well, that's a student that normally was going to test well anyway.
Yes.
And that's why the schools really don't feel like they need test scores. They can just say, okay, let's see your advanced classes, who took them and who did well in that. And it's a total proxy for test scores.
Absolutely.
And to the extent that it isn't, that kid that is so super motivated, that works that hard, that kid will be okay anyway. They might just outwork somebody. Like, not to get too personal, Dave, but we know your sister Ann.
Yeah.
We know how hard she worked, you
Yes.
know, and she, academics didn't come as easy to her as to you, Andrew, or Michael, I would argue, but she outworked everybody and ended up being a doctor.
That's correct.
And, it was hard for her to do extremely well on the MCATs. You and I know she worked her tail off. But there's that person, but that person is still okay. They just outwork everybody with their discipline and drive.
Correct.
I don't know if that makes sense, but that's kind of how I see it.
Yes.
Before we move on, Dave, I do want to say there's a quote in here from Bob Schaefer. We've talked about Bob Schaefer a lot. As we know, Executive Director at Fair Test, National Center of Fair and Open Testing, and the strongest advocate of test optional, test blind. Schaefer's got the stats in this article. And what he says is 72% of all bachelor's degree granting institutions now are not requiring testing for the fall of 2021. And he says more than 600 new colleges and universities added test optional admissions since March of 2020. And more than 100 of those 600 have said their new policies are not just for the pandemic, but they are either permanent or they are multi-year pilots. And so he says, we can be certain that at least 1,170 schools, more than half of all four-year schools, will be test optional for the fall of 2022. And he predicts that that number is likely to be much, much higher. Any final thoughts on testing, Dave?
No, I think it's something that we've always expected. And, once again, in a situation where the demand curve for colleges is falling, it's in the college's best interest to remove unnecessary barriers to getting in acceptable students who would be successful. And clearly, test optional is one of those ways of doing it.
And that's a good segue to our fourth point, which is about access.
Access. And this, the quote I chose is a gentleman that you have had on for, I believe, a multi-part interview series. Gil Villanueva, the Associate VP and Dean of Admissions of Richmond. Why don't you tell us a little bit about Gil, Mark? When did you have him on?
For those who never heard the interview, Gil's a great guy. He's served in multiple different schools in leadership roles and admission. But he's an interesting guy. He grew up in a family, I want to say 12 or 13, and had a one bathroom. So, he came over from the Philippines, and he said, he jokes in my interview with him about how poor he was. And so he's now the, Dean of Admission at Richmond. He has a real passion for access. In fact, before I interview a lot of people, I asked them, what do they want to talk about? What do you have passion on? And he said, I'd like to talk about things like imposter syndrome and what it's like being dirt poor on these campuses and resources that are there. So that's what my whole interview with him is, how the the under-resourced kid can make it to the finish line, because he said, I was that kid. So he speaks out on this topic because, that's a little bit about who he was. Go ahead, Dave, take it away.
Absolutely. So I was going to say it makes sense that his point, and I'm going to quote him, is that in all of these discussions, quote, low-income student applications and enrollment will continue to lag, and be ready for more financial aid applications because 2020 was, in his words, quote, no bueno. Which, because my daughter is taking Spanish with your daughter, I know that means no good.
Good for you. Good for you.
I'm learning.
You are learning, because you're next for your lessons, my friend.
Absolutely.
Dave pays my daughter in advance for his own Spanish lessons, and then he goes AWOL and says, I'm too busy.
Oh, well, I'm afraid that she's going to do some optional testing on me and find out, you don't qualify. You're in remedial Spanish. I'll have to get you another tutor.
Yeah, the interesting thing about this conversation about access is it's quite complicated because, there's going to be, and the article talks about this, there's going to be a real demand to redress the fact that under-resourced kids have been really hurt by the pandemic. So there's going to be a real pressure to do a lot of things in terms of your outreach, in terms of your admissions, in terms of your recruitment. And then there's also a lot of government initiatives in place There's a lot of growth for the double the Pell Grant movement and all those things. We'll see whether or not they get enacted, but they put pressure on institutions to do more when it comes to access so that you don't have just your school populated just with kids from well-resourced families, because that's not the real world. And that's really not part of most schools' mission to, I mean, your mission is to educate everybody, but part of your mission is also some societal change, usually is involved in most schools' missions. So there's going to be a lot of pressure around there. And the article talks about that. And some people in this article that are quoted are a lot more optimistic than others about how many of the inroads that colleges will make. One thing we didn't share when we quoted from Lucido from USC is he believes the pandemic is going to put more pressure on colleges to covet families who can pay because of the funding. Because we never brought that up, but we'll bring it up now because it's obviously the opposite point, right?
Yeah.
In one sense, you're trying to reach out to kids who are really hurt by the pandemic, under-resourced kids, urban kids, a lot of students of color. But on the other hand, you need money to run your school. And so there's a conflict, there's tension there. And I think for a lot of schools, they're going to wish they had the resources to do more, but they're just going to feel like we just can't. Their heart's going to be in the right place, but their budget and their pocketbook is going to say we're not going to be able to do what we'd like to do. And I'm more in the camp of what Lucido says, and that there'll be more of an emphasis on families that can pay than there really will be more. There'll be a lot of talk around access and outreach, but not a lot of dollars directed there.
They cannot continue to raise tuition at double-digit rates like they have in the last 20 years to cover. So they're in a real bind. So, yeah, for most colleges, the heart will be there, but the money may not be to address what's really going to be a crisis, I believe, in low-income and minority student access to college education.
Yeah, and the article closes with just a bunch of pronouncements from a bunch of different people about things that they think will happen. Were there any of those that you wanted to comment, Dave, or not really?
No, the summary is that the bottom line is that the outlook is still cloudy. No one really knows when we're going to get over this COVID pandemic, or if we are fully going to ever get over it because of all the issues with vaccinations and variants and so forth. And so that all these predictions come with caveats in that nothing is written.
Yeah, but I'll say this. Now, mind you, Brennan actually had this article come out in January. We're picking up 2 months later. Speaking from the perspective of 11 VP of enrollments and deans that I was on with this week, everybody is really, really optimistic about the fall being open, being in person. They all said, not only for us, but we don't know of any school that's not planning on being open and planning on being in person. And the news of the fact that vaccines are going to be available to everybody by May. Everybody is either moving toward doing in-person tours now, or they have plans to do them over the summer. And so there's a real optimism about a return to normalcy. I don't think we're fully going to get there in the fall of 2021. And like you said, we're always subject to some new variant coming and sabotaging things. But there is a lot of optimism amongst admission leaders that things are really going to get back to normal when it comes to people can come and visit, students can live on dorm. I don't know if it means there will still be mask requirements or not, or they'll practice some aspects of social distancing, but people can see the end in sight, and there's some optimism about it.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Dave, there's a few things I didn't see in this article that I would have thought someone would say. One is a continued increased emphasis on demonstrated interest.
Yes.
Another is something you and I talked about a few weeks ago on our In the News, which is schools getting more and more creative at coming up with special programs that can generate revenue and can appeal to the needs of the public, whether it's broadening their certificate programs or increasing hybrid educational opportunities so their reach isn't just limited to people in their immediate locale. Those are a couple of things I'm also looking to see if I was coming up in this year as well that I didn't see quoted here.
Yes, and we've done podcasts on both those issues in the last few months, and I think that those are good points.
Yeah, but this is a great article, and I'm going to tell Brendan. For those of you who regular listeners of the podcast know this, for you new you don't know this, but Brendan and I were colleagues together from 2001 to 2004. We both worked together in the Westtown office. He was like the associate director of college counseling. I was more in an adjunct role at that time, focusing more on traveling all around in the admissions side. And I didn't have the caseload he had, but I was still involved in the college counseling process. And we were colleagues together. And we've also had him on the podcast 2 different times. He writes for all kinds of people. He writes very well. But to me, this is my favorite article that he does every year. Although I will say this, next week's article is a Brennan article as well. And it's a really good one.
Right.
We have back-to-back Brennan articles. He's also reached out to a lot of admissions people to look at how they're changing their recruitment. And we'll be talking about that next week. So we got back-to-back articles. But I love this, and I'm going to let him know, like, Brendan, you got to do this every year because, like, hearing what everybody says about the changes, to me, that's really interesting.
Absolutely. 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 Absolutely.